All right, so this is part 2 of the American Revolution, fighting the American Revolution, and we're going to look at the details of a few key battles. Now, this is a survey class, so we're not going to go into all the battles. We're going to kind of cover the whole Revolution in one lecture. To give you an idea of how unjust that is, when I was in grad school, I took a whole semester class just over fighting the Revolution, just over the battles. So, you know, it's a much more complex system than what we're going to be showing. We're trying to get a survey. All right, let's look at the First Continental Congress. The First Continental Congress meets in June of 1774. It's called by the Massachusetts Committees of Correspondence. If you don't know what a Committee of Correspondence is, it's an organization whose purpose is to get out propaganda or get out information to other colonies. So the way it worked would be Massachusetts would put all of the grievances they had with England on a letter. They'd send it to Virginia. Virginia's Committee of Correspondence would then list theirs, and they would send it to the next colony. It's a circular letter. By the time it gets back, everybody's kind of aware of what's going on. Well, this Committee of Correspondence calls this Continental Congress, urging support of Boston. You remember the Boston Port Act, where they had closed the port of Boston until after the tea had been paid for. They're urging to support Boston against that. It condemned the Intolerable Acts as unjust. Now again, if you remember the Intolerable Acts, the English called them the Coercive Acts. That was like the Administration of Justice Act, the Massachusetts Government Act, the Boston Port Bill, the New Quartering Act. All of those things were part of those Intolerable Acts. You got to love that name, the Intolerable Acts. We had a principal here once upon a time that used to put things out that I would call the Intolerable Acts all the time. He didn't get it. All right, so they also issued the Suffolk Resolves, which called for a voluntary boycott of English goods. We've kind of already talked about that. And a limitation of colonial exports. So we're not going to export goods to England, and we're not going to boycott any goods that are coming in from England. That's a great economic warfare tool. The problem with it is England was really the only nation that we traded with. So if you boycott England, you're really boycotting everything. You're hurting your own people. They can't get goods in, nor can they sell their goods to others. They denounced the quartering of troops. We talked about quartering of troops in the last lecture, at least we were supposed to. You know, if you don't know what quartering of troops are.
Isn't that where they like live with people?
Yeah, they would literally, the law required, yes ma'am.
Didn't you say there's someone in history that got a scar because he said something to a troop that was in
Yeah,
France?
Andrew Jackson, we'll get to him a little later on. Yeah, he got a scar the rest of his life. But the quartering of troops was a absolutely hated law. England didn't want to build barracks for their soldiers. So they passed this law that said that you were required to house and care for soldiers. So you'd be sitting at home and hear that knock, knock, knock at your door. I just scared you to death, didn't I? Hear that knock at your door, and congratulations, you get to take care of this young soldier.
They get to do whatever they want to.
Well, to an extent. Now, legally they didn't get to. They were supposed to respect your privacy, but they didn't always. And there were cases, although they were few. I will say that most of the redcoats tended to behave themselves properly, but there were enough that didn't. There were cases of theft by these soldiers. There were cases of rape by these soldiers. You know, you're being forced to house somebody and they rape your wife or your daughter. You think that's going to leave you with a little bit of a bad taste in your mouth? It's going to cause another separation between us. So they're calling for a denunciation of the Quartering Act. They also stated very loudly that only the colonial assemblies had the authority to tax the colonies. Here is their justification. We vote for our assemblies. We don't vote for Parliament. Therefore, we're not represented by Parliament. They have no authority over us. This is the first time that's really put out in, spelled out in writing. It is important that at this point they are not talking about independence. The First Continental Congress is not demanding independence. In fact, they're trying to heal things with England. They're just listing grievances with Parliament. They're actively trying to be good Englishmen. By the way, that term Congress, I know I've said this before. Don't think about that as lawmaking body like we do in America. All the word Congress really means is meeting. Okay? Technically, these three schools are meeting in Congress right now. We are in Congress. We're in a meeting. Okay? All right, so not independence at this point. Let's talk about the Battle of Lexington and Concord a little bit. After the Massachusetts Committees of Correspondence began their actions, Parliament declares the entire colony of Massachusetts in open rebellion and puts it under martial law. That means they're under control of the military. Martial law is where the military replaces the government. There is no elected government. And General Gage is sent in as the military governor, and he is ordered to arrest the rebel leaders. The two that he's looking for are Sam Adams and John Hancock. We know these guys. Sam Adams is famous for leading the Sons of Liberty. John Hancock was a leading smuggler, and he had been president of the Continental Congress. So these guys need to be arrested. One of the things that they're also trying to get is they find out that the Minutemen, the militias, have a stockade of weapons in the small towns of Lexington and Concord. Lexington and Concord are literally just across a bridge from each other. Okay? They're two little neighboring towns. So they send these people to try and capture Lexington and Concord so they can get the weapons and capture the rebel leaders. Sounds like a Star Wars movie, doesn't it? Capture the rebel leaders. At this point, nobody wants war. The British don't want war, and the Americans don't want war. But both sides are also unwilling to back down. So how are you going to notify these people? Well, we've got to come up with a system where we'll know what the British are going to do. And you've all heard the story of the Old North Church and the lanterns. They come up with this idea that they would go up in the steeple of the Old North Church, which was the tallest building in Boston. And they would put one lantern in the steeple if the British were marching in by land. And they would put two in it if they were coming by sea. And across the harbor, they had riders waiting that were watching. And when they saw it, they would ride in the correct direction and warn people. So they would know what direction the British were coming. Pretty ingenious idea. I have some questions about it. I was in Boston. My sister lived there for a while. And I went to the Old North Church, which still stands, and I managed to talk them into letting me climb up in the steeple because I'm a history geek and I like to do that kind of crap. And I got up there and looked out, and I didn't feel like it was really high enough for that to be an effective way to do it. But history tells us that that's how they did it. It seems to me like it's a story that was kind of made up afterwards, if that makes any sense. Like the line in the sand of the Alamo. It seems that way to me. but I don't know that for a fact. I do know that there were riders sent off. There were a bunch of riders. There were about 40 of them. There are about 3 that we really know. 1 we really know real well. 3 whose names historians know, and a 4th guy out there that was really effective but nobody knows. So there's all kinds of weird stuff. The big riders, and you all know Paul Revere. He's the one everybody knows. You learned that in Miss Thistlebottom's class. Remember the poem by Long? Miss Thistlebottom is every social studies teacher that's ever lived. Miss Thistlebottom told you that. Remember the opening lines of the poem? Listen, children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere.
Huh?
That's a different poem. But slap me on the rear and call me Paul Revere?
Yeah.
I don't know that.
My brother used to go around the house screaming that all the time.
Yeah, your brother's weird. Okay. We've all learned something about your family now. Okay. Paul Revere is famous for his ride. And we all know the story. We all know the version of the story where Paul Revere heads off on his horse and he's riding through the towns yelling, "The British are coming! The British are coming!" Right? And people hear that and they rush out to the streets with their rifles to prepare to fight. It's a beautiful story, and it's almost true. Well, it's true-ish. How's that? I doubt he yelled, "The British are coming," because that wouldn't make any sense. He was British. We were all British. I mean, that would be like if he was riding around the streets yelling, "I'm coming, I'm coming, I'm coming." It doesn't make any sense, right? You've got to say something else. He probably said, "The regulars are coming," or "The redcoats are coming," or "The lobsterbacks are coming," something to that effect. Probably the regulars are coming. But he did warn some people. He didn't make it very far. He was actually arrested part of the way through and held indefinite, or held for a period of time before being released. 2 other guys, William Dawes and Samuel Prescott, also left to warn Lexington and Concord. Samuel Prescott was the first one to make it there. He's the one that actually warned Lexington and Concord. Dawes got arrested as well. There was a 4th rider that nobody knows but should. His name was Israel Bissell. Israel Bissell actually rode through 2 states warning people. He was the most effective rider there is, but nobody knows his name because it doesn't rhyme well, I guess. Listen, children, you shall hear of the midnight ride of Israel Bissell. Doesn't exactly work. He sounds like a Jewish vacuum cleaner salesman, so it doesn't exactly have the effect that it needs. So Paul Revere is the guy that we all know. And not taking any of the heroism away from him. He absolutely was a hero. But there were others there as well. So Lexington and Concord. The British show up and they find that the Minutemen are out on the village green, lined up with their squirrel rifles waiting. Now both sides have been given the command not to shoot. General Gage has said, "We don't want a war. Do not shoot. Her Majesty's regulars are not firing at subjects of the crown. We're not doing this. Do not shoot unless you're told to." The Americans all said, "We're not here for a war. We're here to defend our own rights and nothing else. So don't shoot unless you're shot at." And both sides are trying to stare down the other. They're across the field. General Gage gives the command to turn over your weapons. The colonists refuse. Do you think there's a lot of stress right now between these guys? It's terrifying. I'm an old Marine, guys. I've been in combat. I'm telling you, when you're going into combat, you are geared up, you're excited, you're nervous, you're scared, and you're ready to fight. These guys were that way. I have no doubt of it. And they're staring at each other. Both sides ordered not to fight. And then a gunshot goes off. The English said the Americans fired first. The Americans said the British fired first. And there were some people there in Lexington that said the shot didn't come from either one. It came from over the hill where some guy was hunting. But a shot went off. And suddenly all those geared up energies, both sides just opened fired. Both sides felt like they'd been fired at. And we ended up launching the American Revolution by accident. Okay? We call that shot the shot heard round the world. Not because it was really, really loud. Heard round the world is a metaphor. You all know what a metaphor is. It's where you compare something, right? Something to something. If I said that she's a rat, that would be a metaphor, right? Yeah. Don't look at me like you're going to stab me. All right. Well, the metaphor here of hearing it around the world is talking about the fact that this was the first time in history that a colonial power had defeated a mother country before. We threw off the shackles of the mother country. And the echoes of that are heard for years. It had never happened before. But within a decade, there's a revolution in Cuba. There's a revolution in Haiti shortly thereafter. There's a revolution in England. There's a revolution in Russia. Almost all of Latin America has revolutions. Those are all echoes of this shot heard around the world. They couldn't have happened without it. Okay? At the end of the day, the British go into full retreat to Boston, and the Americans chased them along behind using guerrilla warfare tactics. If you don't know what guerrilla warfare is, it's where you hide behind rocks and use ambush attacks, you sneak attack. By the way, that guerrilla is spelled G-U-E-R-I-L-L-A, guerrilla. If you spell it G-O-R-I-L-L-A, that's a different kind of guerrilla. That type of guerrilla warfare is where you have monkeys in trees throwing coconuts at people. Okay, so make sure you're getting guerrilla right if you talk about it. All right. Up to this point, we still haven't declared independence. We are still not officially at war. Now we're going to have the Second Continental Congress. This is the important one. This is the one we all know. The greatest minds in the world showed up at this one. They meet at what's today called Independence Hall in 1775. And they meet all the way through 1776, where they just become the Continental Congress and become the official government of the United States. Their very first action is to wave the olive branch. They release the olive branch petition. Does anybody know what the olive branch is the symbol for?
Peace.
Peace. Very good. Very good. If you ever see the symbol of the president or the national symbol, the eagle, you see it on the back of a quarter. In one talon it's got arrows, in the other talon it's got an olive branch. It's because one is for war and one is for peace. Okay? Well, they send the olive branch petition to the King of England, telling the king that they are proud members of the British Empire, that they are loyal subjects of the king, and they ask the king to protect them from the evils of Parliament. That's interesting. These guys are saying, we're not at war against our king, we're at war against our Parliament, who has no right to lead us. The king blows this off. King George III, who, by the way, was probably crazy by this point. There's a lot of evidence that George was completely mad. We think he had porphyria. If you're interested in that, there's a great show. It's a Broadway play that's been made into a movie. It's called The Madness of King George, and it's phenomenal. If you're a crazy history geek or a theater geek, you'll love it. If you're not, you'll hate it because it's one of those kind of movies. All right. So with one hand, they're waving the olive branch, saying, "Please, please save me, King. We want peace." While with the other hand, they're waving those arrows, and they're raising an army to fight against the king. And they looked around and they said, "We need somebody, really anybody, to lead this army." And it turns out that they had somebody there in the room. Virginia had sent George Washington as a delegate to the Continental Congress. And Washington had always wanted to be a military man. He had fought admirably well in the French and Indian War. By the way, Washington, when he was 20 years old, applied to be an officer in the British Army. And he was turned down. They said he wasn't good enough. Interestingly enough, the officer that turned him down was a guy named Cornwallis that Washington defeats in the Battle of Yorktown, the last battle of the Revolution. Washington really wants this job, so he has a uniform made. He has this specially made uniform, fits him well, and he shows up and he's got his sword on and his uniform on. And they looked around and said, "We need a commander-in-chief. Who should we use? How about the guy that's already got a uniform? Let's use him." So they made him the commander. That's literally why. Washington was always put in charge of everything. They asked John Adams once, they said, "Why was Washington always in charge?" And I love it, because Adams' statement was, Washington was always the tallest man in the room. He was always picked because he was the tallest. That's what a short man would say, okay? Washington was a giant of a man. He was well over 6 feet tall in a time period when most men were about 5'5", 5'6". Okay?
He's over 6 feet.
Yeah. Washington was a big guy. So let's look at why this Continental Congress is so incredible. Think about this. One meeting and all of these people are there. Let's look at the main characters. John Hancock. John Hancock is a rebel rouser from Massachusetts. He's also the president of the convention. You've all seen his signature on copies of the Declaration of Independence. In the middle, there's that one real big signature. You heard people say that before. Put your John Hancock here. That's because his signature is so famous. They asked him, the delegate from Rhode Island asked him, "John, why did you write your name so big?" And John Hancock said, "It's so fat King George can read it without his glasses." All right? It was important to him. He was ready to fight. He was a supreme organizer, and he was a fair man, a very fair man. He let all sides speak. He didn't try and ramrod anything through. Sam Adams was also a member. Sam Adams was the best speaker of the bunch. He was the leader of the Sons of Liberty. He was also absent quite a bit because he was busy out drinking with his Sons of Liberty guys and causing trouble a lot. But he's going to be an important voice there. His cousin, John Adams, that's a picture from the movie, John Adams up there. John Adams was also there. John Adams is the guy that Thomas Jefferson called the Colossus of Independence. The whole idea of declaring independence was John Adams' idea. Now, he couldn't get it passed because John Adams was not a friendly person. People didn't like John Adams. He was not a nice guy. He was arrogant. He thought he was smarter than everybody else, and he probably was. So people would vote against it just because they didn't like him. But that didn't mean it wasn't a good idea. Benjamin Franklin is there. He's the oldest man in Congress. He is literally a founding grandfather among founding fathers. He's in his late 60s when it starts, early 70s by the time it's over with. And while we don't feel his voice all the way through the documents. He's the guy that provided the wit and wisdom in the meeting. He would often advise everybody. And when things became tense, it was Ben Franklin that had a joke that he would throw out there that would settle things down so that everything didn't fall apart. Benjamin Franklin is incredibly important at this time period. Thomas Jefferson is one of the youngest men there. He is not yet 30 when this convention starts. He is all of 30 years old when he writes the Declaration of Independence. He is a terrible public speaker, but a great writer, a gifted writer. He's the guy that's ultimately going to be the author of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those are Jefferson's words. Well, they're kind of Jefferson's words. He stole some of them from John Locke, but he kind of pulled them together in a way that made sense. Patrick Henry is another Virginian that's there. You know, the famous fire eater with the "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. He's always there to rouse the audience up. So you've got all these people in the same room. It's pretty incredible if you think about it. It's amazing that in a nation, as this whole nation was smaller than Houston is today. Okay? It's very small. And they managed to find all of these people. I would challenge any of you to go to Houston and find that many people of that caliber. The same population size. We're just not putting that caliber of people out anymore. I don't think you could find people of that caliber in our nation, that many of them. It's impressive. All right. So we still haven't declared independence. They're working on it at the Second Continental Congress. And we're going to have another battle. The famous Battle of Bunker Hill. Did I go too fast? Okay, I thought I lost you for a second. Battle of Bunker Hill. The first thing I want to tell you about the Battle of Bunker Hill is it didn't happen on Bunker Hill. It happened on a place called Breed's Hill. So why do we call it the Battle of Bunker Hill? Well, I'm kind of embarrassed to say this because I'm a historian, but it turns out the very first historian that wrote about it got it wrong. He put it on the wrong hill, and we've all repeated it ever since then. So if you look at this picture here, the brown spot in the north, that's a high spot. That's Bunker Hill. Bigger one down there at the south is Breed's Hill. It's going to happen on the bigger one, okay? This is an absolutely essential place to control. That little peninsula that sticks out there, that's Charlestown, Massachusetts. That one at the bottom that sticks up from the bottom, that's Boston. And the waterway between the two is Boston Harbor. Whoever controls that high ground controls the harbor. It is essential that you control it. So we sent in this guy, Colonel William Prescott. Prescott has a couple of hundred men. 200, 250, not a lot. The British show up under the command of Major General William Howe, one of the two famous Howe brothers. One was an admiral and one was a general. They were great military men. Major General William Howe shows up with 1,500 trained British regulars and at least 1,000 more German mercenaries called Hessians. And they surround the hill and start marching up the hill. So half the men coming up the front, half up the back so Prescott can't escape. Prescott orders his men to build a redoubt. R-E-D-O-U-B-T, redoubt. If you don't know what that is, that's just a berm. It's a wall of dirt and sticks. So at the top of the mountain, he builds a 4-foot wall. It just stacks dirt. Why would you do this? Well, because think about it, if you're on top of a hill and there's a 4-foot wall and somebody's marching up the hill, all you have to do is lean over and you can fire, and all but your head is protected. Okay? The wall's this high and I lean over, all you can see is this. Makes sense, right? Well, how accurate are muskets? They're not accurate at all. There's almost no chance you're going to hit somebody like that. So it's a pretty smart thing to do. So he orders his men to load their weapons, get behind the redoubt, and wait. And because they're low on ammunition, he gives the famous command, don't shoot until you see the whites of their eyes. Why? You can't see the whites of their eyes till they're close. We want to make sure every bullet hits something. So they're waiting. They're up there on this hill. They've got their guns loaded. The British are marching. They've got their drums going, their fifes going. You can hear them. It probably sounds like thunder as they're marching up here. Okay? At the last minute, they're 30 feet away from you. And Prescott orders them to lean over. They all lean over the redoubt with their muskets, and they all at once they fire. This wall of lead just flies down, and it decimates the whole front rank of the British. The British go into a full retreat all the way back to the bottom of the hill. 250 Americans just forced 1,500 British regulars into a full retreat. Victory. But then the British come marching again. A second time. Prescott says again, okay, we'll give it another shot. Load your guns. At the last minute, fire. They lean over. Wall of lead fires down a second time. The British go into a full retreat. Victory. We've won again. The British start marching again. They've now lost hundreds of people. A third attack. And we're out of bullets. Prescott orders his men to load their muskets. He says, load it with your gunpowder. Put in your packing. And then fill the barrels with knives. With nails, glass, and pebbles. Whatever you can find. And they start breaking porcelain that's up there and putting the pieces of broken porcelain dishes in there. They start putting nails in there. They put glass in there. They put rocks. They fill it to the rim. And again, wait till the last minute. And all at once they fire. This time it's not a wall of lead. It's a wall of glass and nails and rocks. And it just rips them to shreds. A third time, the British go into a full retreat. But here's the problem. That trick only works once. Why? Because it blows your guns up. Your guns can't be fired after that. It's too damaging. The guns are done. So Prescott is forced to surrender. He raises the white flag. At the end of the day, William Howe controls the high ground. The British won the day. But they lost several hundred men. We lost 2. We're going to call it a victory. And all across the country, people are going to cheer the Battle of Bunker Hill. Because we proved that the most powerful military in the world can be held back. They can be outfought. All we have to do is get them enough ammunition and the Americans can win. You want a comparison? I compare it to the Alamo. We lost the Alamo, but we still celebrate it because a handful of Texans fought off a much larger Mexican army. for 13 days. Same concept. All right. We're still not officially at war. We still haven't declared independence. We've had the Boston Massacre, we've had Lexington and Concord, we've had Breed's Hill, but still they haven't voted. What it's going to take to change minds is this guy, Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine is one of those guys that's given me an inferiority complex my whole life. I like to kind of fancy myself a writer. I've sold some things to some different places. I've written some things. But I'm not a writer at all if you compare me to this guy. Thomas Paine, when he puts pen to paper, he can change minds. He's a Scot, first off. He's from Scotland. Hates the British because of how they treated Scotland. Comes to America and becomes a patriot and a troublemaker. Writes a book first called The Crisis, and then wrote Common Sense. Common Sense was the big one. Where he said that it's destiny that we eventually be independent, because it's only common sense that an island cannot rule a continent. He says all you got to do is look at a map. England's this little bitty island, we're a vast continent. They can't possibly really rule us. So in Common Sense he says, we need to stop pretending to be loyal. We are not loyal. We are something different. We are rebels, and we should be openly rebelling. He went so far as to call King George III the royal brute of Great Britain. He's calling him an animal. He argues that we should have a Republican government. That's a small r Republican. That's not the same thing as the Republican Party. That just means a government where you elect your leaders and they make their laws for you. A lot of people in the South didn't want a Republican government. They wanted an aristocracy of the intelligent. They wanted the elite to rule. This guy says, nope, common men should rule. And his writing was so good that it changed the minds of Americans and pushed Americans to war. John Adams once said that at any given point, 1/3 of the country was for war, 1/3 of the country was for peace, and 1/3 of the country swayed with the winds. I always tell my kids, reminds me of Dallas Cowboys fans. I'm a Cowboys fan, okay? 1/3 of the country loves the Cowboys no matter what. That's me. 1/3 of the country hates the Cowboys. That's the communists. And then 1/3 of the country likes the Cowboys when they're winning. Well, that's what people were like at this time. But this guy managed to sway that third that was on the fence over to independence. His words were so powerful. I'm going to read some of these words to you because I think it's worth hearing them. That's how most Americans got this, by the way. The pamphlets were printed on broadsheets, and some would read it, but most would hear it. They would go to their local bar, and somebody would read this out loud, and so they could hear it. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. What we obtain too cheap, we esteem too lightly. It is dearness only that gives everything its value. Heaven knows how to put a proper price upon its goods, and it would be strange indeed if so celestial an article as freedom should not be highly rated. Britain, with an army to enforce her tyranny, has declared that she has a right not only to tax, but to bind us in all cases whatsoever. And if being bound in that manner is not slavery, then there is not such a thing as slavery upon earth. Even the expression is impious, for so unlimited a power can belong only to God. Powerful words, guys. He's saying, look, England is abusing their power. England is turning us into slaves. The king does not have that power. Only God has that power. And people heard those words and they stood up and fought. Awesome. I love the thought that somebody can put pen to paper and move people to that kind of power. Okay? The pen truly is mightier than the sword. But don't try and stab somebody with a pen. All right. So now that that's out there, and there's all these ideas floating, the people are finally kind of ready. They're kind of getting close to being willing to declare formal independence. It's going to be John Adams, again, that demands the independence. But because he is so disliked, people won't vote for it. They won't support his independence. Just trying to see where we are. So what are we going to do? We need somebody that is popular enough to get the idea out there. So they look around and they find this guy, Richard Henry Lee, the guy they used to call Light Horse Harry. Richard Henry Lee was not the smartest man in the world, but he was from a very wealthy family in Virginia. And he is told to go back to Virginia and try and get a formal declaration of independence from the Virginia House, the Virginia Assembly. He goes back, he gets the declaration, he brings it up, and it's time to vote. The problem is, when the time came to vote, it looks like the vote won't pass. What are we going to do if the vote doesn't pass? Well, we're a little nervous about that. The vote may not pass. So they need to buy some time. The delegate from Delaware makes a motion. He's trying to kill the Declaration. He doesn't want independence. He's the only delegate that's really against it at this point. And he makes a motion that all votes for independence must be unanimous. And the motion passes. Well, good God, we'll never get unanimity. Never happen. Because this one guy says no. That's all it's going to take. Well, they need to buy some time. So Franklin comes up with the idea to buy time. He says, I need 30 days. We need to write a declaration. We need to write something to tell the world why we're doing this independence. So the declaration was an afterthought. We just need to write something down. It was a way to kill some time. And they assigned young Thomas Jefferson to write it. Jefferson locks himself up with a copy of John Locke's Treatises of Government.
Teachers, please release the cross-country students to the cafeteria. Please release the cross-country students to the cafeteria. Thank you.
So, they, every time they come over that thing, I lose track of where I am. ADD, I can't stay focused. So, he locks himself up with John Locke's Treatises of Government, where John Locke had said that all people are born with the rights of life, liberty, and property. And he agrees with that, but property doesn't sound right. He changes that to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He meant property, though. He called these natural rights, or human rights, rights that were God-given. They weren't given you by a government. They were given you by God. And a government can't take away that which was given by God. Finally, The Declaration is formally approved on July 2nd, 1776. That should really be Independence Day, July 2nd, but it's not.
It's a really great day.
That was the day that it was formally approved. July 4th was the day that they signed, the last person signed it. So it's going to be July 4th when they sign the Declaration. How many more of these are there?
Just a few, I think. 1, 2, 3. There's only 13 of them, I think.
There's 3 more?
Four
4 more?
left.
Okay. I want to finish it then. All right, Patriots and Loyalists. Let's talk about the different terms here, because we don't always get this right. A patriot is anybody that supports rebellion, and they're often called Whigs. Whig is a term, an English term that means the opposition party, okay? Whatever party's out of power is the Whigs. Well, they're almost always the younger generation. You would expect that, wouldn't you? Wouldn't you expect it to be younger people that were the rebels? The older people have money. They don't want to risk anything. Younger people, you don't have much to risk. You're willing to gamble everything. Okay? That's what we would expect. The Loyalists are the older generation. They're usually called Tories. So a Tory is a Loyalist, a Whig is a Patriot. Same thing. And again, the vast majority of the nation are shifting. Families were even divided. Benjamin Franklin, one of our greatest patriots, his own son was the royal governor of New Jersey. His son was a Loyalist. So you had families that were... This was a civil war, guys. Okay? Once we declared independence and the war started, patriots began punishing the Loyalists, oftentimes confiscating their money to pay for our war effort. So what's going to happen is there's going to be an exodus out of the country where Loyalists leave the nation. This Loyalist Exodus is going to be important. About 50,000 of these guys leave. You want to stay in here, Jamie, or you want to go back to the other room?
I don't care. Stay in here.
Okay.
Make it easier on you.
About 50,000 of these Loyalists leave, and it's going to leave a very liberal voting bloc. Things are going to change quite a bit. If you have a liberal voting bloc, what that means is you have a voting bloc that is willing to vote for very liberty-minded ideas. Okay? Let's talk about how Washington won the war. Because he lost almost every battle. Washington was smart enough to realize that the key to winning the war was keeping your military together. And that was hard to do. The British are trying to crush him. In July of 1776, 500 ships with 35,000 men land in New York to fight. And Washington looks around, and he has an army of 18,000. And he famously says, "As I look around, I notice that my army can hardly be called such. The men are sick, aged, or cowardly. They're constantly running away. He's worried about them all the time." 18,000 sick, incredibly young, incredibly old, and quick to run against 35,000 battle-tested veterans. So what are we going to do? Well, Washington's got to find a way to outsmart him. And he does it at the Battle of Trenton. You've all seen the painting of Washington crossing the Delaware. Did I put that on this? I don't know if I did or not. There's a great painting of Washington, and he's standing at the front of the boat, kind of pointing, and Madison's got the flag behind him, crossing the Delaware. It's the stupidest painting I've ever seen. I love the painting. It's beautiful, but totally stupid to think that's what he did. The Delaware River, by the way, is a Category 4 river. That's a massive rapids river. And it was December in New Jersey. It would have had ice in it floating. It would have had waves. You're not going to stand up in the front of your boat. That would be stupid. I ought to tell you another story about that, but I'll save it. So he needs to find a way to outsmart the British. So what he does is he orders every one of his 18,000 men to build a campfire. Each one built their own campfire. Now, that doesn't sound very smart. I'm an old military guy. We never built our own fires. We all gathered around and built one fire. But he ordered everybody to build their own fire. Why would you do that?
Make your army look big.
Makes your army look big. Very good. Your army looks massive when they look across. And at night, when they're looking through a spy scope, fires, can you see anything else? All you see is the lights, right? So they built these big fires, and Washington left a few people back to tend the fire. And under cover of darkness, he marched the rest of the men down the river. Crossed the river in the middle of the night and attacked. And the reason he was able to attack is because the British and the Hessians all went to sleep, and they left one person up watching. And he was looking across, and as long as he saw those fires, he thought that Washington and his men were still there. So he outsmarted them. They literally captured thousands of Hessians. They did the same thing again at Princeton. He's pretty effective at this. Washington is good at outsmarting people. At the Battle of Saratoga, we call this the turning point of the Revolution. Write that down somewhere, because that's going to be important. This is the turning point. This is when the Americans started winning. The British were under the command of Gentleman John Burgoyne. They call him Gentleman Johnny because he was a gentleman of the highest class, and he was part of that upper class of England who would show up, and he went to war literally with everything he owned. He brought his furniture and his wife and his kids and his dogs and his silverware and his plates and dishes. He brought all that with him. And when they would go, they'd set up these great big tents and then set up his furniture and all, so he could go to war like a gentleman. He was also a brutal fighter who had never lost a battle. He's got 6,000 British regulars, 500 Indians with him, 138 artillery pieces, cannons, and then 30 baggage carts with his personal baggage in it. 30 wagons full of his personal belongings. And he's going to go to war against the Patriots that were led by Horatio Gates, they called him Granny Gates, Benedict Arnold, and Daniel Morgan. Benedict Arnold, by the way, is the big hero of this battle. Gates is going to get most of the credit, but it's Benedict Arnold that comes up with the plan. What they decide to do is they decide to retreat through the woods. And as they go down these trails, Benedict Arnold has people cutting trees down behind them to slow the British down. And the British have these big artillery pieces and these wagons. Think they can move very fast through the woods? No, they're sinking in the mud. They're terrible. So they're much slower. And they start breaking it up into small groups by dropping these trees behind them. And they start to spread out. Y'all have all seen parades before. When the parade starts, everybody's close together and they start walking. And as the parade gets longer, it stretches out further and further and further. Right? Well, that's what happens in the military too. As you march, the front starts marching, but it takes a while for the back to start. And over time, it just keeps stretching and stretching and stretching. Well, when it gets stretched out so big, the Americans would hide and they would attack small portions. So they basically turned the advantages the British had of this large force into a disadvantage. And at Saratoga, we defeated Burgoyne and made him surrender. This is going to be important because this victory is going to convince the French that we really can win. And they're going to start supporting us. The French are going to come in on our side. The last battle. Now again, I know we're going through this way too fast. I apologize for that, but it is a survey. The last battle is the Battle of Yorktown. Super important battle. George Washington's crowning moment. It's a peninsular campaign. What that means is they managed to trap the British on a peninsula. Washington comes in and gets the British to chase him, and he kind of does this J turn at the peninsula. So when the British chase him onto it, they trap him off there. So now there's no escape via the land. Then the French showed up from the sea, and they prevent the British from either reinforcing or escaping via the sea. And they start dropping cannons on them from the back. So the British are having cannons hit them from the sea. And then from the front, every time they move forward, the Americans are there waiting to shoot at them. And we managed to trap them on this spot. And General Cornwallis is forced to surrender to George Washington. And I love the story of the surrender. Great story. Cornwallis doesn't want to surrender to Washington because he considers Washington to be basically a redneck cousin. Remember, this is the guy, Cornwallis is the one that turned Washington down for a commission. And now he's gotten beaten by him. So he sends out a lieutenant to present his sword. That's how you surrender back then. You gave your sword over to somebody. So this lieutenant shows up with Cornwallis' sword. And Washington goes to accept it. But Washington's aide, a young man named Alexander Hamilton, stops and says, "No, sir. No, sir. This is not appropriate. You're a general. You cannot accept a surrender from a lieutenant. That would be a slap in your face. It's inappropriate. Let me find somebody of appropriate grade." Washington says, "Fine." Hamilton looks around, and at least according to legend, it may be an apocryphal story, but according to legend, he went and found a scullery boy. You don't know what a scullery boy is. It's a boy that's probably about 12 years old, whose job it was to wash dishes and clean toilets, clean the latrines. And he had the scullery boy accept the surrender. I love that because if it's true, it means that the greatest officer in British history had to surrender his sword to a boy that cleaned toilets. That's how we slapped him in the face. The British didn't know what to do. They actually played the march, The World Turned Upside Down, as it was being presented. Because to them, the world had turned upside down. This upstart, redneck, backwoods colony just defeated the most powerful country in the world. Everything's upside down. All right, we will stop there for today. I will see y'all next week. I'm going to try and get the first part of your study guide out to you before Monday. I'm not going to promise it'll happen. Everybody's grades should be in Blackboard now. If they're not there, tell me. If I missed somebody, tell me. There was one student at Brooklyn whose test didn't come through. I've already notified that person. Have your proctor send it again. I've forgotten who it was, but I've already notified him through email, so that shouldn't be a problem. All right? I will see you guys next time.